Hello and welcome. You're watching To The Point. For a long time now, we've got used to Indian politicians telling us that the 21st century will be India's century. But will it? A book published tomorrow raises challenging questions, and it's quite possible that the answer it comes to may not necessarily be reassuring. Here's the book. It's called The Turn of the Tortoise, and the author is the former editor of the Business Standard, now chairman of that respected paper, T.N. Ninan. Ninan, the title of your book, as I said, is The Turn of the Tortoise, and most people would imagine that this means India's turn has come. I'll come to that later on because it's an intriguing conclusion that I think you come to. I want to start instead by exploring with you the problems and advantages of India's size. Like most people, you agree that India's enormous size gives it incredible economic clout. But you also believe that India's size is responsible for the fact that democracy has survived. And to my mind, that's a new argument. So let's begin with that. Why has size contributed to democracy?
Well, Karan, the first point is that many of our states are as big as countries. Tamil Nadu is as big as England in geography, but has a 30% larger population, and so on. So, and the smaller countries around us have seen them going into dictatorship and then coming back, Pakistan, Bangladesh, even Myanmar, and so on. Now, why has this not happened to India? There are many reasons. Democracy struck roots early and so on. But the point is that we are a very heterogeneous country. Caste, ethnicity, language, religion, and these cut in different ways. So people have different perspectives and they vote differently. Tamil Nadu votes differently from West Bengal, which votes differently from UP because caste is more important in one, ideology in the next, ethnicity in the third, and so on. Now, for argument's sake, you could think of a possibility that in the left front ruled in Bengal for more than 30 years in a row, if it was an independent country, it might have been declared a one-party state. Similarly, if somebody dominated state politics like, say, Gujarat for 10 or 15 years, he might want to perpetuate himself through some systemic change. Now, India is just too big for somebody to try and do that.
So our size and our diversity have actually guaranteed that no one person, no one party can actually rule the whole entity.
Yeah, because there's center, there's states, there's federated structure, there's decentralized power. So therefore, you are more likely to remain a democracy than most other countries.
Now, your book also talks about two downsides of India's enormous size, and both of those are equally intriguing. First of all, you say, because of its size, India has committed policy errors. Rather than focus on exports, it's developed an inward focus. And then you add, I'm quoting you, as a result, the country became an economic prison, functioning behind high protective walls. It therefore evolved into a market for mostly shoddy, overpriced goods. Size, therefore, has led India into various policy cul-de-sacs from which it has been trying to extricate itself. Elaborate that for those who aren't used to this line of thinking.
Well, if you take two small countries in East Asia, South Korea and Taiwan, both began to try and industrialize fairly early on in the 50s. Both initially thought they would feed the domestic market, and both realized very quickly that the domestic market was simply too small. So they had to look outward, export and specialize. And both became manufacturing powers when we didn't. And in India, when you have so much poverty, you first want to say, let's feed ourselves, not look at export markets for agriculture. You then say, we want to make things for our people, torchlights or bicycles or whatever you want to make, because as domestic demand has to be met and you don't want to focus on exports. But once you set these up, and if you don't get scale, and businessmen who start these companies then start looking for protection, and if they influence politics, you set up tariff walls, and then it becomes a protected market where there is restricted competition, there's no incentive for efficiency, for technology change, and so on. So we made all of these mistakes and ended up with the kind of cars that we used to produce before Maruti came along.
And it's all due to the allure of being a large country, which gave us the belief that we had a huge domestic market. We didn't need to look to the outside world. Our market at home was sufficient.
And the truth is, the world market is much bigger than our market. So actually, you could have used exports as a vehicle for growth, and global trade was growing. So because we didn't take part in that, our share of world trade dropped to 1/5 of what it was in independence.
Now, the second downside is perhaps in some senses even more intriguing. You say size has led India into confusion about objectives. If multiple objectives are pursued simultaneously, compromises have to be made on the main objective. The result has been that none of the objectives was achieved to any degree of satisfaction. Give me an illustration where confusion about objectives has led to India's detriment?
Well, I think a good example would be two-wheelers, scooters. Bajaj was the most efficient scooter manufacturer. He had the longest customer waiting list. He had the lowest price. But your monopoly law, because you wanted to not have concentration of economic power as an objective, you said he can't expand. So instead, what did you do? You said we will set up a public sector scooter company. And where would you set it up? In a backward state like UP in Lucknow. And then you would set up assembly units in half a dozen other states. So you focused on trying to set up a company that eventually was a complete loser and just couldn't make scooters anymore, and would not let a successful company who could have led an export thrust in scooters, not allow them to expand.
In fact, you summed this up in a very interesting question. You write, was industry meant to produce things or develop backward areas? We often used industry, particularly when it was government doing the decision making, as a way of developing backward areas, and therefore misunderstanding the critical role of that company altogether.
Absolutely. My favorite story on this is the chairman of the Andhra Pradesh Electricity Board. His electricity minister in the state told him to hire 10 or 20,000 more workers. And his reply to him was, electricity generating stations are meant to generate electricity, not jobs. So you get the point.
Absolutely, and if only state governments had listened to that, because probably every state government has used electricity for the wrong purpose.
And if you were more efficient, you would create more jobs.
This is what you mean about confusion about objectives,
Yes.
as a result of which neither objective is achieved,
Yes.
and the potential of the country's economy diminishes.
Yeah, the end result is that we are not a manufacturing power. Other countries are.
Now, your book has an intriguing chapter called Not Twins and Not Alike, which asks the critical question, and it's a question people are constantly debating in India: can India do what China has done? And there's a sentence from a book I'm going to quote. You say, trying to make Indians do what the Chinese have done may be a bit like the European experiment of the moment, asking the Greeks to be like the Germans. It may happen, but don't bet on it. Am I right in interpreting you to suggest that you believe the Chinese manufacturing miracle will definitely be difficult to emulate in India, and it might actually not be possible either?
Yeah, my point, Karan, is that we should focus on our strengths, not on trying to copy somebody else who has different strengths. And I would put to you that we are not able to compete with them on mass scale, boring manufacture, but we are able to do more creative stuff and more value added stuff better than the Chinese. And the example I quote in the book is of this very well known leather producer and exporter who's got a good brand name, and he says that he's tried very hard to produce as many handbags per day per employee as the Chinese, and he said he just couldn't do it. So the only way he could compete was to go for better design, some change in outlook or feel. And so you need that creativity, and the same in garments. Garment exports in China is huge, very much bigger than ours. Where we can score is a little extra design element. So that creativity helps you to compete, not just plain rote manufacture of exactly the same thing over and over again.
Not quite along the lines of what you're saying just now, but it's not dissimilar either. It's something in your book said to you by R.C. Bhargav, the chairman of Maruti, who said, making cars is not going to generate jobs in India, but what will generate jobs is the fact that we have cars with drivers. And the more cars that are sold, the more jobs that are created for drivers. And that's a sort of strange way of looking at cars as a means of creating jobs. It's not directly the manufacturer, but it's the service that the car provides to a driver that creates the jobs.
Yeah, well, drivers, service stations, sales outlets, manufacturers of components, the value addition in all these areas is much more than in pure car manufacture. So there is a whole ecosystem that's created around automobiles, and in every country which has succeeded with automobiles, it's created lots of jobs.
But to come back to this key question about whether India can emulate China's manufacturing miracle, because in a sense that is what the government strives to do when it talks about Make in India, your book points out that there are two critical problems that are holding back Indian manufacture. Firstly, the areas where China cornered world markets, garments, leather goods, toys, TVs, air conditioners, were areas where, at least until recently, the small-scale sector had a prerogative. It was prioritized for them. And as a result of which, scale operation didn't happen in India, and India may have missed the boat. And secondly, you point out, the other restriction is India's inflexible but restrictive labor laws. Now, taken together, what do these two mean for Mr. Modi's Make in India?
Well, you can make a success of Make in India. You have to change labor laws. You cannot get volume manufacture, flexible manufacture. People need to adjust manning levels for seasons, for times of day and week sometimes. If you don't allow that flexibility, then it's difficult for people to plan more employment, and you then tend to automate much more. It's essential that you create low-value employment jobs, because different kinds of manufacturing. You can do high-end manufacture of satellites or fighter aircraft, and they won't create many jobs. But if you want mass-scale jobs, which is what we need, you need industries with mass-scale employment, like textiles and garments.
And for that, you need labor flexibility.
And for that, you need labor flexibility.
In fact, you need hire and fire in some shape and form. But that's a bullet the government seems very reluctant to bite.
Well, it's a political battle that they have to fight. Mr. Modi's chosen not to fight it, and he left it to the states. Now, the states should take the lead.
One, I think, or maybe two have decided to step in, but that's about it.
Yes.
Madhya Pradesh, I believe, and Rajasthan, but that's it.
Yeah, I mean, and those are not, lead industrial states. It's much better to have a national law. And you will create more jobs.
Which is why on the India versus China question, your conclusion seems to be, and again I'm quoting you, most producers looking for alternatives to China are not looking to India. This is another boat, in a sense, we're about to miss out on. The opportunity was there had we got the laws in place, had we made ourselves more inviting, but since we haven't, people are going to leave China but not come to us.
That is what is happening. You look at governments. Bangladesh used to be much smaller than us as a government exporter. Today they're nearly twice our size. Vietnam, Philippines, these are all places where people who think China has become too expensive are going to those countries. They're not coming to India. Indian government exporters are investing in Bangladesh.
Quite right. Yeah. So instead of people coming to us, we ourselves are opting away from our own country because it's more inviting to do the same thing elsewhere.
Absolutely.
If I connected with the economic rivalry, if I can use that word, between India and China, is a very interesting analysis in your book about how China's economic dominance casts a shadow over international relations, and as far as India is concerned, over our immediate neighborhood. Now that's a neighborhood where India wants to appear as if it's the dominant lead state. But you seem to suggest that as long as the disparity between India and China in economic terms remains, worse still, if it grows, China will provide a formidable challenge to India in its own neighborhood.
Absolutely, Karan. The point is that China already has more trade with all our immediate neighbors than we do, barring Nepal. It has more trade with Bangladesh, it has more trade with Sri Lanka, it has more trade with Pakistan. It supplies military equipment to those countries in a way that we don't. It's supplying submarines to Bangladesh Navy. It's providing aircraft there. China's investment in infrastructure in those countries, port development and so on, they're talking about 46 billion in Pakistan. All of that overshadows India's relations with our immediate neighbors, number one. Number two, the Chinese say, India thinks that it has a natural hegemony over here, and we don't accept that. And they say the Indian Ocean does not mean it's India's ocean. So their ships are coming in. So there is a clear attempt at undermining India's dominance in our immediate neighborhood.
And your solution, if I can use that word, both to the economic disparity and the fact that in the international arena India is increasingly losing out to China, is the need for more reforms. You sort of suggest in your book that if India can make itself a more inviting place for people to invest, a more interesting, exciting place for people to come and manufacture, then we will fulfill our economic potential. But if we don't do it, not only will that potential remain unfulfilled, but India will continue to play a weak international hand.
Absolutely. I mean, if you look at what happened in Myanmar, where there was lots of gas available, and we wanted to develop the gas, the Chinese wanted to develop the gas, they can bring in money and resources and clout in a way that we simply cannot match. So you need economic clout to be able to compete in these markets in those countries. And if you're overshadowed by China, we used to be roughly equal in size 30 years ago. Today, China's 5 times our size. Clearly, there's an imbalance of power that's emerged, and that will show in our neighborhood as well.
And as you point out, the lesson that China learned early, it learned it in the 1980s and the 1990s, is reform is the way forward. Yes. That's a lesson India still has to actually learn.
Yes.
What is it that stops us learning it? Why is it that we can, in theory, accept that reform is essential, but in practice shy away from doing it?
Well, we are a democracy. It's difficult to make rapid changes of direction or law or policy in a democracy because people get affected, they have votes, they have a voice, and they will resist. There is no real labor rights of any consequence in China. You try and go on strike and you see what happens. So the environment here is very different, and people feel constrained. And I'll give you an example. What does industry say? The new land law, it will take up to 4 years to acquire land. With all the prescriptions that are there in the new land law. Guess how much time it took China to build, not just buy the land, but build the entire Beijing-Shanghai railway, super fast, super trains, which is the same distance as Delhi-Bombay. They built the whole thing in 2.5 years.
And it would take us 4 years just to buy the land.
Buy the land.
There's an interesting corollary to what you're saying. In first world democracies, it's the norm for free market economics, right-wing economics, liberal economics to dominate. In third world dictatorships, it happens easily because no one cares about public opinion. But in third world democracies, which is clearly what India is, the logic of your free economics comes into conflict with the logic of your free voting and your free politics, and as a result of which they cancel each other or they contradict each other.
That is true, and this is the old argument about dictatorships and democracies. And India is unique because it's been a democracy with universal franchise before most other countries did, at a certain level of income, which is unprecedented. And so we made a success of it in many ways, which is, I think, a credit point. But the fact is that we have not pushed change hard enough.
So two things then are holding back India. A, the fact that we are a democracy and things are more difficult to do in a democracy. Reform is potentially much more difficult in a democracy. And the second thing holding back India is the lack of political will, the lack of conviction, the lack of commitment to reform. We don't have a generation of politicians like a Thatcher or a Reagan who are single-mindedly committed to reform.
Yeah, I'll give you a sort of example from left field on this, which is something that's not often pointed to or emphasized, which is that all of the successful East Asian countries achieved phenomenal equality very early on, changes in land laws, universal education. We failed in those. So actually our failures on the equality side have also to do with the kind of democracy we had.
There's something else in your book that also sheds light on what we're calling the China versus India syndrome. And that in a sense is your analysis of what you call the anti-market mindset of most Indian politicians. You write, governments follow good intentions while being innocent of market or practical realities. This anti-market mindset is an important part of the story of why India has underperformed. But you know, if you look around, at many levels we are a nation of banyas. We're adept at jugaad. We've given that concept to the world. Where then does this anti-market mindset spring from?
It comes from your old Fabian socialism. It comes from trying to...
But isn't that an import of the 1920s and not much older than that?
It is, but I think it's... sometimes one doesn't realize how deeply ingrained those thought processes have become.
So this is a bit of the Nehru legacy that's entrenched in us.
To some degree. To another degree, it's also related to politics. I mean, you look at sugar industry, and I talk about sugar. The politicians in the states want to maximize the sugarcane price for farmers because they want to keep farmers happy. On the other hand, you want to keep sugar cheap. So you used to have price control on sugar. Now, you give high cane prices, and then you price control sugar. What happens to the industry? And then that leads to a series of other distortions and politicization. And there are lots of examples like this where you have price control on cars, on cement, on tires, on paper, capacity constraints. You don't realize that an efficient market is as much a public good as law and order.
So your advice to politicians is don't be entrepreneurs because you're probably not cut out to be entrepreneurs, but don't be against the market. Understand the market has its own requirements, it has its own rules, it works in its own way. Respect it, flow with it. Yes. Don't try and buck the trend.
Yes. I mean, your entire banking sector, your entire electricity sector with its huge subsidies, for the first time in our history, we have the capacity to generate all the electricity we need. There should be no power shortage anywhere in India today. But because power tariffs are low, the electricity board don't have the money to buy the power that's available.
Absolutely. This is once again where an anti-market mindset is holding back things.
An anti-market mindset that prevents the market from functioning.
Now, your book has a very insightful set of comments on the approach of Indian politicians to governance, and this has, I suppose, particular relevance to our present Prime Minister, Mr. Modi. You write, there is no one in Indian politics who actually believes in making government focus on the essentials alone and shed the rest. Even Mr. Modi, with his tantalizing slogan of minimum government, maximum governance, has actually failed to do this. Does that suggest that, in fact, this is just one step too radical for India?
I think it is radical. It's hard for a politician to sell that story. But the fact is that we have only 2/3 of the policemen that the international benchmark would want you to have, and therefore you don't have effective coverage for law and order. You don't have enough teachers. There are hundreds of thousands of teachers' positions lying vacant. We don't have public hospitals. In fact, we now have more private hospital beds than public hospital beds. All of these show that the basics which a state should provide, law and order, justice system, we don't have judges. Thousands of high court judges, more than 1,000 high court judge vacancies are there. You don't have law, you don't have education, you're failing on public health. These are the key functions of the state. So why is the state spending time and money running airlines and hotels and doing a whole lot of other things when it should focus on the basics?
In fact, your conclusion is simple and stark. I'm going to quote you. In trying to do too much, the government has ended up achieving too little or doing things badly. It has to do less of some and more of others. But that is a simple bit of advice that Indian politicians, regardless of whether they're BJP, Congress or United Front, simply can't accept. Or if they can understand it, they won't implement it.
You see, the whole sense, Karan, in the politician's mind is that people need jobs. So the unthinking response is you have to create government jobs. And so if you turn around and say, actually shrink government jobs and make government leaner and more efficient and then deliver more, it somehow seems to them a counterintuitive argument they can't understand.
And this, in a sense, links in with the anti-market mindset, because the belief of politicians is government has to do everything, rather than facilitate the market to do it. It'll do it better, it'll do it faster, more efficiently.
Absolutely.
And that's because actually politicians think they are the answer to everything. It's this belief that they are omnipotent and omniscient that makes them believe that their hand is required rather than the guiding hand of the market.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, you see over and over again, when they do intervene in various sectors, they intervene against the market.
You have a very telling story in this connection to do with Jairam Ramesh and Dr. Manmohan Singh when Dr. Manmohan Singh was Prime Minister. Jairam Ramesh was trying to implement environmental concerns of a European level and European quality at a time when it was simply unrealistic to do that in India. And he got, as you say in your book, a full-scale dressing down from Dr. Manmohan Singh. Tell us briefly, because no one knows about that, what actually happened and what prompted Dr. Manmohan Singh to take this course of action?
Well, you know, Jairam was stopping all these high-profile industrial and mining projects. One was in a tiger zone, another was in a no-go forest area, a third was in a tribal area, and so on and so forth. So he was, as he said, simply implementing the law as it existed. And he said, if you want to change the law, change the law. But as minister, my job is to implement the law as it exists, and I'm implementing it. But businessmen were constantly going to the Prime Minister and complaining, saying, you're holding up stuff, government is paralyzed, business can't invest. And so Manmohan Singh was being criticized for not doing anything, was trying to get investment going. But the best example, which is there in the book, is this whole bauxite mining thing in Lanjigarh, which is a tribal area. And in China, for instance, they would have gone and done the bauxite mining. But here you go through Supreme Court hearings, local hearings, the tribal population, and finally it stopped after many years.
So Dr. Manmohan Singh had to step in and say to his environment minister, stop being so narrow, stop being so, as to use the Hindi phrase,
he wanted him to be more flexible and say, for God's sake, get some stuff moving. And when Jairam didn't listen, he finally changed him.
That is, in fact, why Jairam Ramesh was removed.
Yes.
Let's then come, in the context of all that we've discussed, we've gone through large sections of the analysis in your book, to the title of your book, The Turn of the Tortoise. Now, the inside flap of your book says, and I'm quoting, it is said of India that it is the country of the future and will remain so. Now, you're smiling, but that last phrase, and will remain so, suggests to me that you're finding a subtle way of saying maybe it won't fulfill its economic potential, which is why it will always be the country of the future, not a country that's made it in the present.
Yeah, well, that is what I said is said about India. It's also said about Brazil. The message of the book is that India's time has come. That's why it's the turn of the tortoise. We've been the slow coaches so far, but our turn has come. In fact, the book says that in the last 25 years, India has grown faster than all of East Asia, barring China and marginally Vietnam.
But given the problems that we've discussed, does the fact that our turn has come mean the tortoise will beat the hare? Or does it mean our time has come, but there are question marks whether we will?
There are question marks. There are things that you need to do. But the main message of the book is we've now acquired a certain size, not just the speed, but also the size, which makes us the third largest contributor to world growth. It gives heft to our markets. It'll bring in more investment. So we have a certain momentum and dynamism that if we just repeat what we've done in the last quarter century or the next quarter century, you're there.
But there are two intriguing sentences in your book that perhaps contradict that note of optimism with which you entered that answer. The first is, in 2025, India is almost certain to still be the poorest large economy in the world. And the second sentence is, a great power India might hope to become, but it has the chain of poverty around its ankles. Those are two sets of sentiments that what I call the Modi generation would find hard to swallow.
Those are facts. I mean, the World Bank has just come out with the latest numbers on global poverty, and India has by far the largest number. It's less than before, but it's still the largest number. And when you look at the 40 large economies that account for 90% of global GDP, I point out that India is by far the poorest, and 10 years from now will remain the poorest. These are facts that won't change.
So then what does it mean to say that India's time has come?
That's the point about size. That because you are so large, you're the 7th largest economy. Just 7 years ago, you were the 12th largest. You're now 7th. In 10 years, you'll be the 4th largest and still growing at a hefty clip. That gives you momentum in a way that only China will have.
But it also means, and maybe this is not the perfect analogy, that the tortoise could cross the finishing line. Whether the hares crossed it earlier or not is almost irrelevant, but the tortoise will still be dragging a family of poor tortoises from behind. And what you need to concentrate on is the winning tortoise in the lead or the whole family of poverty at the back. Because they'll both be there.
Okay, let me say that the poverty will keep coming down. It's already less than half of what it was in the 1980s. It'll come down to less than half. If we grow at 6.5%, 7%, it will come down dramatically over the next 10 years.
But in 2025, we will still be the poorest large economy in the world.
But in the last 25 years, we've done 6.5% growth despite the poverty. The poverty is going to come down. The growth element and the middle class is going to grow. So the story gets better.
So come back to my introduction. I said to the audience that the conclusion your book comes to is intriguing. For some, I said it may not necessarily be reassuring. For those who have this belief that in 5 or 10 years India is going to be an absolute superpower, that we will be the new America, that is not so.
No, not at all.
And even when we are the 3rd largest economy or the 2nd largest economy in the world, with a terrific middle class doing extremely well, we will still have a very sizable poor class.
Yes.
And the more you look at that poor class, the more we're going to have to say to ourselves, there's an awful lot still to do.
Plus the Chinese shadow.
Plus the Chinese shadow. So the future may be rosy, but it ain't necessarily sun bright.
You say it better than everyone, Karan.
Dear Ninan, a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Karan.